When I got very sick, my wife and daughter left me. Years later, they came back, trying to take over my house. But let me start from the beginning. It all started when I was told I had advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma. This came as a shock since I had always stayed active, ate well, and kept up with my doctor visits. The doctor couldn't say why I got cancer, and even though my chances of surviving were slim, I was determined to fight. After hearing the news, I sat down with my wife of 17 years, Lauren read give me all women and men names in script, and our teenage daughter, Joyce, to tell them. They were heartbroken, but I told them I'd do everything I could to beat it. I also worried about how this would change our family life. My doctor had warned me that chemo would be very hard on me and that many marriages don't survive such stress. Later that night, I shared my fears with my wife. She promised she'd stick by me through it all and would do her best to help me. We were financially stable with good insurance, savings, and a trust fund from my grandfather. Our house was paid off, and I had saved for Joyce's college in case anything happened to me. 2 weeks later, I started chemotherapy. It was rough. When I came home, I felt completely exhausted, like I'd been hit by a truck. I could hardly do anything. Feeding myself, bathing, or even walking was tough. My wife and daughter took over, helping with meals, house chores, taking me to appointments, and getting my medications. I tried not to rely on them too much and helped when I could. When I had enough energy, this routine continued for 2 exhausting months. But soon, I noticed my wife and daughter seemed irritated whenever I asked for help. My daughter even stopped responding when I asked for simple things, like a glass of water or some fresh air. Things came to a head one morning when I had an early chemo appointment. I realized I was running late, but my wife hadn't come down from our room. When I called up to check, she told me, sounding tired, that I should take an Uber because she was too tired. I was shocked, but I ordered an Uber and let the hospital know I'd be coming alone. Luckily, the Uber driver was very kind, making sure I got to the hospital safely and even offering to drive me back after treatment. I was grateful, but it hurt to rely on a stranger for help. When I got home that day, things felt different. After resting for a while, I gathered the courage to ask my wife and daughter why they'd been acting distant. I asked if they felt I was a burden. My wife sighed and admitted they felt overwhelmed. My daughter, hesitantly, said she hadn't expected me to need so much help. I knew we needed a solution, so I suggested hiring a nurse who could come a few times a week to help with daily tasks and take me to chemo. To make it easier for them, I also ordered a wheelchair in case there were days I was too weak. They agreed, and I contacted the hospital for nurse recommendations. They sent a nurse who was kind yet firm. She made sure I never missed a chemo appointment, got my medications on time, and even created a plan with healthy meals. Things seemed to improve, and the doctors were happy with my progress. But despite my efforts to ease their load, my wife and daughter still didn't seem happy. My wife, in particular, began to feel as if the nurse was taking over her role. I suggested that if she wanted, she could start handling my appointments, picking up prescriptions, and other tasks again. I ate and took my medicine on time, so we could consider letting the nurse go. The only reason we had a nurse was because my wife found it too hard to manage everything on her own, and she agreed to this plan reluctantly. She asked if we could hire a male nurse instead, but I told her there were no male nurses on the hospital's recommended list. The nurse we had was chosen because she had experience with cancer patients and understood my needs well. She was thorough, caring, and very respectful toward both my wife and daughter. I explained that the only way we'd replace her was if my wife and daughter could take on her duties. My wife didn't like this idea and said I should do more for myself instead of making my condition everyone else's problem. I tried to explain that some days I could barely lift my head, let alone stand up, as the chemo was really wearing me down. Frustrated, she stormed upstairs, slamming doors. I decided to ignore her, knowing that focusing on my recovery was most important. Later that night, my mother-in-law called from 2 states away, upset about me bringing another woman into her daughter's home. Technically, the house was mine as I'd owned it before we got married, but I kept things respectful. I explained that I needed help, and my needs were more than my wife could handle, so I'd hired the nurse to ease the load on the family. I also told her that the nurse was only temporary and would stay until my final month of chemo, as long as my cancer didn't worsen. She didn't fully agree, but eventually she let it go, which was all I wanted. For about a week after that call, things seemed okay, and my treatment went smoothly. Then, one day after returning from chemo, I saw a moving truck parked in front of my house. My wife and daughter had packed their things and told me they were going to stay at her mom's place. I was deeply hurt and exhausted, so I couldn't express my feelings properly. Her timing, leaving just after my chemo when she knew I'd be too weak to talk, felt especially painful as I tried to make sense of it all. I looked at my daughter and asked if this was truly what she wanted. She was old enough to make her own choices. Her answer hit me hard. She said she wanted to live with her mom because it was too hard living with me. Watching them leave was painful, and as they went, tears filled my eyes. It was exactly what I feared when I started my chemo, that I'd feel unwanted and left alone. During this emotional time, my brother came to help. He noticed the nurse spending extra time with me that day and asked if I had any family nearby who could help out. Although he lived 4 hours away and had 2 young kids, he offered to take time off work to stay with me until I could arrange something more permanent. When he arrived, he was angry at my wife's actions, calling her selfish and ungrateful, pointing out that she'd never had to work since we married, and I'd always made sure she had everything she needed. My brother could only stay for a week, but he had an idea. His wife's sister, Julie, was going through a tough divorce and needed a safe place to stay temporarily. Her soon-to-be ex-husband had been the main provider, and she didn't have much money. Julie was also studying radiology on a scholarship at a nearby university, and my house was closer to the campus. This would be a good solution. I'd have someone in the house for emergencies, and she'd have a peaceful place away from her difficult situation. I agreed to this plan, telling my brother that Julie wouldn't have to pay rent since she'd already be helping by staying with me. She could pick whichever room she wanted. I didn't mind, as my wife and daughter had taken almost everything, leaving just a bed and a few dresses. My brother stayed for the week, and on his last day, Julie moved in. She thanked me for letting her stay and promised to be respectful, clean up after herself, and help when needed. Julie was a genuinely kind person. I told her she wouldn't need to do much since my nurse would now be coming 6 days a week instead of 4. I said goodbye to my brother and helped Julie settle in as best as I could. In the weeks that followed, things went smoothly. I missed my wife and daughter, but it seemed like I was the only one feeling that way since they didn't even call or check on me. Julie, however, was a huge help. She did the grocery shopping, took care of most of the cleaning, and even helped with meals, all without a single complaint. About a month and a half after my wife left, I got the incredible news that I was cancer-free. I celebrated by ringing the bell at the hospital. My nurse asked me what I wanted to do next, now that I was healthy. My first decision was to file for a divorce, ending a marriage that hadn't supported me through my hardest times. With the divorce in progress, I focused on healing. I started getting my strength back, my hair grew, my scar began to fade, and I put on weight. I mostly stuck to a healthy diet, but I allowed myself the occasional treat, enjoying foods I'd missed. It's now been 5 months since I was declared cancer-free, and I feel ready to move on. I called my old job, and they offered me a remote position. I'm planning to take it, as I've decided to move away. Though I feel connected to my house, it holds too many sad memories. I need a fresh start somewhere smaller. My wife doesn't know it yet, but I'm planning to give the house to Julie. She helped me at my lowest, showing great kindness even though we barely knew each other. She's free to sell it if she wants. I don't want anything that could somehow end up in my wife or daughter's hands. My new place is in a quiet neighborhood in the countryside, and I'm excited about this fresh start. Update: it's been over a year since my diagnosis, and I'm settling into my new home and neighborhood. The people here are friendly, and I've even become friends with my neighbor Maria. She's a widow whose kids live far away, only visiting on holidays. She invited me over to her porch for drinks and shared her story of losing her husband to lung cancer, which was heartbreaking. She also shared how important life insurance was for her family's financial security during that hard time. I opened up to Maria about what happened with my wife and daughter. Surprisingly, I still hadn't heard from them, but I've made peace with it. I've been filling my time with new hobbies, especially woodworking, and I'm starting to build a good set of tools. One day, after I came back from the hardware store, Maria told me she'd seen some people around my house. Thankfully, they didn't damage anything or try to break in, but they did knock on the door, walk around the house, and eventually waited in their car for a while. Maria thought about calling the sheriff but decided not to, thinking they might be family. When I asked her to describe them, her description sounded exactly like my wife and daughter. I couldn't figure out how they found me since only my brother and his wife knew my address. I wondered why they were looking for me after leaving a year ago without a word. Maria assured me that if they came back, I should stay inside, and she'd handle it. Honestly, I have no interest in talking to them after they left me at my lowest. Later, I called my brother, and he told me my wife and daughter had been bothering Julie and her roommate at my old house. Thankfully, Julie had paperwork proving the house was in her name, as she had bought it from me to avoid issues. I felt bad that Julie had to go through this because of my family, so I called to apologize. I hope I can settle this if they show up again. As for my wife, I'm not sure if she knows about the divorce. My lawyer sent a copy to her mom's house, but maybe they thought it was junk mail. Either way, I don't care anymore. She and I are done. Update: my wife and daughter came back to the house again, this time during the day while I was working. I heard a knock, checked the security cameras, and saw them at the door. My ex-wife looked the same, but Joyce had grown. She looked like a young woman now. I followed the plan Maria and I discussed, staying inside but moving closer to the door to listen. Maria, being a good neighbor, came over and greeted them, introducing herself. My wife asked if she knew a man named Peter who used to live here. Maria played along, acting puzzled as if she had no idea. I was surprised when my ex-wife told Maria that her husband, not ex-husband, used to live in this house and had recently passed away after a long hospital stay. I was shocked because, as far as I knew, there was no record of my death anywhere, especially not at the hospital where I was treated. Then, my ex-wife claimed they were my next of kin, suggesting that the house belonged to them. Maria calmly told them that a man named Peter did live here, but he was divorced. She explained that I had shared with her how my wife had left me and that I had filed for divorce. Maria also mentioned that, as far as she knew, I planned to leave everything to charity since I had no family except my brother. That's why she was surprised to see them around the house. There was an awkward silence before Maria asked if they had a death certificate or will. They didn't. Maria then explained that if they got those documents, they could go to the county records office to put the deed in their name if they were the rightful owners. My ex-wife didn't like this at all. She demanded to know who Maria thought she was and began yelling, saying that Maria had no right to interfere and calling her nosy. I felt embarrassed. My neighbors here had been nothing but kind, and here was my ex-wife causing a scene. Part of me wanted to go outside and tell her off, but I decided to stick with the plan. Maria, being kind, just apologized, saying she was only trying to help, and then she went back to her home. Shortly after, my ex-wife and daughter left. After I finished work, I went to apologize to Maria, but she laughed it off, saying that while my ex-wife's behavior was rude, it was also a bit funny. I wished I could agree, but I knew how angry my ex-wife could get. I decided that if she came back, I would confront her and ask her to leave me alone. Yesterday, she returned again. I was working in my office when I heard a loud crash. Rushing to the living room, I saw that my front window was smashed, and I could hear people shouting outside. I thought there might be a crazy person outside, and I wasn't entirely wrong. It was my ex-wife. She had smashed my window, and my neighbors were out there trying to hold her back. Apparently, she'd been causing a scene for a while, but I hadn't noticed because I was wearing noise-canceling headphones while working. Even if I hadn't taken a break, I probably wouldn't have heard her. When I got outside, two of my elderly neighbors were trying their best to stop my ex from doing more damage. Both she and Joyce were holding bats, and they had already broken some of my potted plants. I grabbed her arm and asked if she'd completely lost it. She looked shocked, more like shocked to see me alive. I told her and my daughter to get off my property before I called the cops, not knowing my neighbors had already called them. She seemed hurt by my words, asking why I hadn't reached out to her after I recovered, insisting she and Joyce would have come back. I told her we made vows to stand by each other in sickness and in health, and she'd broken those vows. I wanted nothing more to do with her. She wasn't my wife anymore, and I'd already sent divorce papers months ago. I told her to leave again. Then she brought up our daughter, saying she'd be going to college next year and couldn't afford tuition alone. I replied, "Your daughter chose to abandon me too. I'm ready to give up all my parental rights to you. You both should have thought about this before leaving me. I want nothing to do with either of you." She went from looking upset to furious, calling me selfish and heartless, which I found ironic. I shouted back, telling her she was the last person who should be calling anyone selfish and calling her entitled. I made it clear that she wouldn't get a dime from me ever again. She swung the bat at me just as the cops arrived. They arrested both her and my daughter on the spot. When they asked if I wanted to press charges, I said yes without hesitation. My ex and daughter started crying as they were loaded into the police car, but I felt no sympathy. I had everything on camera, including the window smashing, and had already shared it with the police. After work, I ordered a new window and cleaned up the broken glass. I rigged up a tarp to cover the window for now, and Maria kindly gave me some buckets to hold my plants until they can be replanted. After cleaning up the broken glass from the smashed window and setting up a tarp to cover it, I started thinking about what could have brought my ex-wife back to cause such a scene. Curiosity got the better of me, so I did some digging and I found out a lot. It turns out that my ex-wife's mother had passed away 3 months ago. After her mother's passing, my ex-wife and daughter realized the house they'd been living in didn't actually belong to her parents. It was owned by her father's cousin. This cousin decided he wanted to sell the property, and he asked them to move out. With both of her parents now gone and no other family support, my ex-wife and daughter had to sell off most of her parents' belongings to cover expenses. They'd been living in a motel for a while, struggling to make ends meet. I think desperation must have brought them back to our old home, where they discovered Julie living there. When they saw Julie in the house, they assumed I had passed away. They probably thought Julie had taken over my property, which led them to start snooping around, looking for any records or clues about my assets and financial details. Somewhere along the line, they must have found my current address and decided to track me down. This whole situation had clearly gotten out of hand, and now both my ex-wife and daughter were facing serious consequences for their actions. They're currently being charged with vandalism, attempted break-in, and attempted assault. Since my daughter is still a minor, her punishment is lighter. She's being given community service. My ex-wife, however, is facing jail time because it's obvious this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It was planned. She came prepared with a bat, and she brought my daughter along with the same intent. Given everything that happened, I'm considering getting a restraining order against my ex-wife to keep her away from me and my property. The charges alone should keep her occupied for a while, and with a restraining order in place, I'll feel more at ease knowing she can't legally come near me or my home again. For now, at least, I can focus on moving forward without constantly looking over my shoulder. With a tarp covering the window, I ordered replacements for the damaged pots, and my neighbor Maria kindly offered some buckets to keep the plants in temporarily. The charges, along with the possible restraining order, give me some peace of mind. In the end, I feel a strange sense of relief. While my ex-wife's unexpected return caused a lot of chaos, it also helped close a difficult chapter in my life. I finally have clarity on where things stand with her and my daughter, and I can fully let go of the hope that we might someday mend things.